Hey everyone, welcome to Pop Culture Pastor, where we look at movies, music, comics, and more from the perspective of faith. Welcome to the show, everyone. We are now beginning our end of the year coverage. So today we're going to be talking about the best books of 2022. My guest today is my friend Dara Tinius, who is a librarian with the Metropolitan Library System in Oklahoma City. So I'm bringing in someone who seems to know some things about books. She's always who I go to for recommendations for what to get my wife for Christmas. So we'll talk about that after we're recording. But welcome to the show, Dara.
Thank you, Chris. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, we wanted to have you on for a while, and figured this is the best time to get such a book nerd on here for us to share some of the things. I guess we went to college together, but we didn't really know each other. You were friends with Anna Jane, with my wife,
Yeah.
and it's really only been recent years, I think, that we've connected and realized we have a lot of the same interests. And
hmm One of our shared interests is Anna Jane.
yes, of course, who doesn't love Anna Jane? As I always say, everyone else is a dummy for not marrying her.
You got her first.
hmm so that, if nothing else, that proves that I have good taste. Whether even if you disagree with my taste in books or comics or whatever, I got good taste there. Well, one of the things that we usually like to do on the show is let our guests give us a little bit of their spiritual bio. So if you just want to share a couple minutes about your journey spiritually with church and so on, kind of give us a little bit of that.
Okay. Yeah, we said earlier that I was on the deconstruction train and I said it was more like a train wreck. So, well,
hmm
what a
Yes,
time.
that's been a theme in a lot of the episodes, deconstruction and faith and how you move on from that.
What a time to be alive.
Yes, makes my job very easy.
Yeah, I bet it's like a walk in the park every day.
hmm
So I, like you and Anna Jane, was raised Church of Christ my whole life, my whole family, my extended family. As far as I know, back until I think they were some of the early early adopters of Church of Christ.
hmm
So like, you know, so so all like 100 years or whatever.
Oh yeah, yeah. We're not a really old movement.
That was a dig.
It's 200.
I've never said I was good at math. That's why I'm a librarian. Um, so yeah, I mean, I grew up going to conservative but fairly mainstream Church of Christ. Like I mean, they were very conservative, but not like one cover.
Fundamentalist.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
no, no offense to one covers, but like not like not too hateful or too I don't know. I say that they weren't fundamentalists, but I mean, in their beliefs, they are
hmm
fundamentalists. In their
Right.
actions, they weren't. Maybe if that makes sense. Like, very kind people who I think had really good intentions. But really, honestly, even when I was a kid, I'd be like, "This is weird. Like, what about this?" And that was not encouraged. So it was always just like, oh, well, I shouldn't be asking those questions, or if there's something wrong with me, or if I had more faith, I wouldn't be asking those questions. The thing that always bothered me the most and first was the lack of women involved in anything aside from children's ministry or
hmm
director of children's ministry,
Yes, not minister, director.
coordinator.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so but I was a good girl. I was the oldest child. I was going to do what I was supposed to do. And this is what was right and the only right way as far as I knew. And so I just had to try harder, pray harder, be better. And if I fit
hmm
in, then it would all, I remember somebody telling me one time, well, if you just, multiple times, if you just get more involved, if you just find your
mm
ministry, if you just work harder, then all of this will make sense. And it's like, okay. And that, I mean, I was able to do that despite some misgivings until like a lot of people, I think 2016 was kind of where I was like,
Mm-hmm.
I don't
Mm-hmm.
think so. And so that kind of began the real, especially I have two daughters and
Mm.
they were hitting kind of puberty pre-youth group times. And so it was getting a lot more impactful to me what they were hearing and what they weren't hearing and who they weren't hearing.
Mm-hmm.
And I just kind of had a night when my oldest daughter was in sixth grade and we were just hearing some, again, by very people with good intentions, just some women role
Mm-hmm.
stuff that I was like, no.
Yeah.
Like I will not
Mm-hmm.
be doing this.
Yeah.
I will not be telling my daughter this. I will not,
Mm-hmm.
I will not, we will not. And so I think we left church that night and I was just like, I can't do this. And I don't
Mm-hmm.
know when or how, but we have to get out of this for our girls. And then so we kind of moved to a more progressive Church of Christ, which they were lovely and a very soft place to fall for a couple of years. You know, then I had more things in my life that were because once you start to see injustice in one area, you start to see it in all the other areas. So,
Mm-hmm.
and that has been true with like the Black Lives Matter movement and so many of the protests. But what really started kind of weighing on my heart was a lot of the LGBTQ Christian, um, just people I was hearing from who were devastated and hurt and their lives were at risk and
Yeah.
who were so broken by every aspect of what they'd been through in church. So now we kind of just needed to rest for a little while, and maybe we even should have probably rested longer. So we just didn't go
Mm.
anywhere for a while. But we have found a really lovely Episcopalian church that we really love, that's
Okay.
affirming, and so we go there now. And
Cool.
so I guess I'm Episcopalian. the old
Congratulations.
the old Church of Christ to Episcopalian pipeline.
Yeah. Yeah. Uh, well, it's obviously more complicated for me if I were going to change, but yes,
Yeah.
there are a lot of. I don't know if there's any this year, but like last year, like two of my favorite books were Episcopalian authors, and I actually had a dream one night after I'd been reading one of them that I like changed over there, like moved
Hmm.
my ordination and all of that. So yeah, books they can be a bad influence.
I know. I remember, I mean, I used to read a lot of spiritual like memoirs and like, especially when I started, like, the deconstruction, a lot of like
Mm-hmm.
theology and just stuff that I had never been exposed to because to be honest, when I was girls were not really encouraged to read that. I mean, it was a lot of there was some fluff stuff that they might have you read, like Lady in Waiting or
Mm-hmm.
things like that. And um, but I didn't really know a lot of the other stuff. And I remember
Mm-hmm.
reading this memoir called Take This Bread by Sarah Miles. And I remember that was probably the most impactful thing I read that just kind of blew my world open a little bit. And I think probably led me to where I am spiritually now, maybe more than any other book. Uh, but I also know that like I was I was talking with my husband and I was like, I feel like Chris's listeners are going to be very disappointed because I have stopped reading most of like the spiritual theology. I think after everything happened this year, it was like I just need to not read about that for a while. I need
Mm-hmm.
to like I know what I believe, and it's not that I feel like I'm at this stopping place because that's not how faith works. And it's like
Mm-hmm.
I really don't want to read anything else about Paul or like agreements or disagreements or pro and con or I don't want to I don't.
Yeah.
And so I just
Yeah.
needed a break from that. And so I have taken that.
Okay, so we won't be hearing any big theological recommendations from you, but
No.
I will cover that, but I will also talk about a lot of comic books because those are my two main interests: theology and comics,
Hmm.
one or the other. All right. Well, thanks for sharing that. One of the other things we like to start with is first pop culture interests. So, what were some of the first things that you were interested in? Maybe books, but other things as well as you were growing up that really got you into reading or
Hmm.
passionate about other kinds of fandom.
The book that got me into like reading with a capital R was definitely Anne of Green Gables. I always say, like, if I had had social media when I was like 9 and 10, or well, I guess you should be a little bit older, but I don't know.
Yeah,
What did the youths
ideally.
do? When did the youths get on Tumblr? I would have definitely had like a Gilbert Blythe Tumblr. There would have been lots of gifts and memes of. I just loved it. I loved this the fantasy world that she lived in and the language, and it was dramatic because she had this horrible orphan upbringing, and it was such a different experience than from my life, which is what makes books interesting to read. So I was very into Anne. I think the first time I ever like binge like as far as like more like pop culture, like getting into all of the related stuff was like Babysitters Club, like going and reading like 200 Babysitters Club books and the super specials and the little sister, and there were all the different kinds. And I was like, I am going to start a Babysitters Club. And I did not, because I didn't really like babysitting, but I liked reading about it. So that was really fun. And then my I was always very into Star Wars. Like that was kind of our like the geek thing that our
Hmm.
family was into. My dad watched a lot of Star Trek too, and so that was always kind of on in the background. But Star Wars, I was very good at finding the romantic part of a story like that and really latching on. So I was
Hmm.
very like
Yeah.
into like the Princess Leia Han Solo thing,
Yeah.
this early
I know.
early shipping, early shipping. Um, like I would do that. Even I remember I would watch like GI Joe and be like, I feel like Scarlett and Duke are gonna get together this one. Like it was. I like
Yeah.
I can
Nice.
feel the chemistry, or like X-Men.
Nice.
I'd be like, I don't really care about the power stuff. Let's talk more about this love triangle
Hmm.
between.
That I mean that actually is a pretty important part of X
Yeah.
Men. I'm gonna talk more about X Men
Hey,
in
let's
just a
see.
little bit.
I never
So
read the comic books, but I did watch the cartoon.
okay,
Um,
that's the number of people who said, yeah, the X Men '90s cartoon was big for me. Like maybe it's just because I'm talking to people of a certain age,
yeah,
but yeah, that was pretty formative for a lot of us.
it was
It's
impactful.
classic.
So
Hmm.
yeah, Star Wars. I used to make my little brother and little sister be Ewoks, and I was Princess Leia, and I would boss them around and do
Nice.
all this. So yeah, that was definitely Anna Green Gables and Star Wars. The two,
The main, yeah, the pillars of pop culture.
yeah.
The Anne of Green Gables cinematic universe coming
Hmm.
soon. Well, speaking of things that we're passionate about, like I said, this is starting 3 or 4 episodes that we're going to be doing on the podcast of kind of summing up the year 2022. So today we're talking about books. Next week is going to be about music. That's right. We're going back to weekly for a little bit. So music next week, and then after that we'll do TV and movies, and then after that we'll just end with some special end of the year consolations and desolations. But today we're talking books. So, Dara, you mentioned you haven't read any deep theology this year, but what's one of the books that you read that really impacted you or that you loved this year?
So again, this is what we call in the sports world a rebuilding year. Is that the right term?
Okay, sure. I am wearing a Chiefs
Ah,
hoodie because I care about fantasy football and stuff now, which is
you've
not on
changed.
brand for me, but it happened.
Yeah, I am just a little raccoon playing around in my trash can these days. Like I just love I you're not going to come to me for literary fiction. You're not going to come to me for I don't know, the I will I mean you're not I'm not going to read a Nobel Prize winner. I'm going to tell you that right now. There's not a
Hmm.
National Book Award, not usually going to be my forte. Although sometimes I accidentally read them.
Hmm.
Usually the YA ones, but I'm never gonna
Oh,
be
sure.
like, I want a happy ending. I want escapism. I want to just be kind of swept away by the characters. I am so much more into romance and fantasy and things that I had kind of, maybe been more into as a teenager. I'm kind of going back to those things.
Well, I think we all do that at various points and in different ways. I was thinking broadly about like my year in books. I mentioned I read theology and I read comic books, but depending on what what time of life I'm in or what phase of life or how the week is going, it may just be comic books or it may not be reading at all.
Mm-hmm.
Like I started this Doctor of Ministry program, so a lot of what I had to read this year was for school.
Yeah.
So I could recommend lots of books on like church leadership, but I don't think that's what most people are interested in. A couple still made it on onto my list, but I'm not going to talk about them here really. And really in recent months, you've been fairly confessional, so I can also be pretty confessional. I've had work that I need to be doing for research for my degree that I haven't really wanted to do,
Mm-hmm.
and so I haven't been reading that. And since I'm not doing that reading, it felt like I shouldn't be doing other reading either. And so I've
Yeah.
just been reading nothing.
You're punishing
So
yourself.
yeah, a little bit. Again, the comic books would still kind of work their way in, but a lot of what I tend to read when I'm not in school is like theological stuff that isn't too deep.
Mm-hmm.
It's for a popular level, but you can tell that it's based on good scholarship or they know what they're talking about. And I mean, two of my favorites I think really fit in that category. But I read both of those like in the first half of the year, so I had to look at them again today. And say, like, okay, what was this actually about?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, right. We all go in these phases of sometimes reading is hard, and I know like we're both big on keeping track on Goodreads of everything that you read
Yes.
and how many did you read this year, and especially in recent years, it's been hard to have the motivation and energy to do that. And so
Mm-hmm.
I hope people that are listening, that you find some things that maybe sound interesting to you and you can check out, but we never want to guilt people into why aren't you reading more? Why aren't you reading about this?
Mm-hmm.
It does take energy for some of these things, and that's I think part of the beauty of books and movies as well and shows is they can be that escapism when you need it. Now some's better than others, and so I assume that's what we're going to be talking about
Yeah.
is what are some of these fantasy or sci-fi or comics that yeah it's going to let you step out of the day-to-day problems that we're facing, but it's written well and it's doing something interesting. All
Yeah.
right, so enough preamble.
Yeah.
What's your first pick today?
So I loved Lessons in Chemistry by Bonnie Garmus. It is actually not fantasy or any of those things. It's a solid historical fiction. That's my favorite book that I read this year that I think that would end up on other people's favorites list. Some of the other
There you go.
ones
Well, that's what matters.
yeah, some of my other favorites people would be like, oh. But it is it's set in the 60s and it's about this woman named Elizabeth who wants to be a scientist, and being a woman scientist in the early 1960s is not easy.
Mm.
And she is basically pushed out of her career. Weird.
Mm.
And she ends up, and she has a lot of personal tragedy and turmoil, and ends up being a single mother, which is not really a spoiler because that's pretty early on. And so she decides to use her knowledge of chemistry to make her daughter like, okay, I make these nutritious meals. Her kitchen is a lab, and so she'll make all this stuff,
Mm.
and it ends up she meets with a television producer who ends up putting her on like kind of a PBS style cooking show, and so she becomes this huge sensation, like kind of a Julia Child type,
Mm.
like, oh, like everyone's like, who is this lady? Why is she so weird? Why is she so strange? Oh, I want to watch her all the time. And so all these women are taking they're coming in to learn how to bake a cake, but they're getting all these lessons on chemistry, like and the
Mm.
actual scientific method, and she's in that she's also making a lot of people angry because she's talking a lot about a lot of things you're not supposed to talk about on TV back then. There's an anthropomorphic dog who I
Ooh.
named 630. So the dog
Well,
does
now I'm
have
in.
the dog has some narration, and I love that dog so much. So it's just it is a sweet story. There actually is a faith component to this book. She is a very avowed atheist, and she's very vocal about that throughout the book. And that doesn't
Mm.
change, nor do they like preach about that changing or. But she has some interactions with some other people who do have faith, both negative and positive interactions that I think could be really interesting to somebody kind of seeing how that plays out in her story. So I love it. It's this author's debut novel. It does not read like a
Oh.
debut novel. It's so good. So I really, that would be my, like, this is a well written, you won't be embarrassed to read this in public.
That's our first major concern here on Pop Culture Pastor. You won't be embarrassed to read this.
That's
Yeah,
what Kindle's
fair.
for.
All right. So the title of that one more time.
It's Lessons in Chemistry by Bonnie Garmis.
Well, my first pick of one of my favorites is a book called Say Yes by Scott Erickson. Uh, Two of my favorite books, actually, I discovered the authors through Instagram, which I don't know if that's good or bad. It's just kind of a thing. So he is an artist. If you're on Instagram, he goes by Scott the Painter. If you follow me, you probably have seen me share his stuff because he does a lot of religious themed art. But like just saying religious art already sounds kind of cringy, but it's actually really amazing, and just a single image can really make you think or open something up. So the book is actually adapting this show that he puts on. He tours and does kind of storytelling, and he says early on, if life is a miracle, why does the miracle suck sometimes? And if God is the giver of the miracle, where is the giver in the middle of all the suckiness? So that's right. That's kind of the deconstruction question that I think we've wrestled with before.
Mm-hmm.
Acknowledging life as a miracle, life as a gift, but it doesn't always feel that way. And he's very confessional through this of his struggles as an artist and just struggles as a human being, and the voices that encourage us to give up. Right, the three main arguments he talks about that we hear are that nothing's going to change, you suck, and dying is better than living.
Mm.
And so he's pushing back against all those. And again, this is not just like a motivational speaker kind of person who's figured it all out and has everything together. It's like this is what I deal with every day, and just kind of feels like that's what everybody's dealing with. And so one of the really interesting points that he makes, going to that last idea that dying is better than living, right? He's someone who's struggled with suicidal thoughts. And so, content warning if that's something that might be difficult for some people. But he has this whole section in there where he's comparing the evangelical, probably overemphasis on the end of the world and this tendency to make predictions about, well, here's when Jesus is going to come back. It's going to be soon. It's going to be, in this date and just, next year. He compares that with the idea of suicide, or at least how he struggled with it, that they're both coming from this impulse, this desire not to be here,
Mm.
right? That this world, this life is not working out the way that I want it to. It seems too hard. And so we just want to be somewhere else or just not be here at all. And he has this image. Since he's an artist, the book has a lot of pictures in it. So if that is appealing to some people, going back to some of the early reading we used to do, that had lots of pictures. This has lots of fun pictures in it. He talks about Jesus as the cosmic janitor.
Mm.
Right, we're just kind of waiting. Well, when Jesus comes back, he'll just fix everything, right? Maybe there are a lot of problems and injustices in the world, but we don't need to worry about fixing those because Jesus is going to come back any day and he's
Mm-hmm.
going to deal with that. We just need to make sure that our souls are ready to escape. And so he's arguing that both that emphasis in the evangelical world and some of the ways that he and others have struggled with the issue of suicide it's this attempt to control the pain of being here. And so he's working through how do you respond to those voices, that those negative arguments. And one of the things he focuses on is wonder, the sense of awe. He calls wonder the rapturous experience of being alive. And that sounds nice, but that's not always easy. And things tend to get familiar, but that we become a visitor to your own life, right? Look at your life from the outside and see what there is in it that can inspire wonder and awe. I want to actually read a quote. So here he's saying something about love, about God, and how those fit together. It says, God is love, and love wants to pour itself into you. But you can't receive love if you secretly hate the person love made you to be. This body, life, soul is the only container you've been given to receive love in. And if all you're doing day after day is trying to trade out that container, then love will always fall flat. You, right now, are the container love wants to pour into. And I'll share it later, but there's a picture of
And there's a picture.
water that's just pouring onto a table next to a cup. And so it's, this loving yourself in the sense, like that's, a phrase that gets thrown around a lot, but, that God made you to be who you are, and God loves that person. So if you hate that person, you're kind of shutting out that divine love.
Mm-hmm.
And so it kind of summarizes, so pushing it back against those three negative arguments: nothing's going to change, you suck, dying's better than living, with the practice of saying, believing that I'm on my way, right? Okay, things may not all change overnight, but I'm working on it. I'm a work in progress. Instead of thinking that you suck or that you're ugly or nothing, you say, I'm a contribution, right? That you have something to add, you have a voice, you have gifts. And then I think most importantly, and the most theological, the response to dying is better than living is that I'm a resurrection.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's acknowledging that, well, yeah, death is actually going to be part of your story, but newness comes out of that. That's I actually have one of his prints hanging in my office. It's a coffin with a tree growing out of it.
Mm.
Right? Resurrection, the idea that new life only comes after something else. It's not just getting to escape. It's going through all the messiness of this life and gaining new eyes to see something different. So that's Say Yes by Scott Erickson, a.k.a. Scott the Painter. So something a little uplifting there. What's another pick from you, Dara?
Okay, so I think I'm gonna do like a quick trilogy of
Mm-hmm.
romance here. So
Okay.
I'm going to talk
I love
about,
it.
so I'm playing in the trash can, but it's the most delicious trash. I have good taste in trash.
Mm-hmm.
So
Good taste in trash.
you can
I love
put
it.
that on my tombstone.
Yeah.
And it's not trash. I feel like, especially women, we have
Yeah.
this reflexive like need to make excuses for like things that we're reading that are more, and it's mainly because there's like romance and things. But I was like, other people don't do that with their genres, so I'm not going to be embarrassed about it anymore. Except that I
Yeah.
probably will because of period culture.
Sure.
So, the first one is Book Lovers by Emily Henry. I loved it so much. It is, of course, perfect if you love books. It's about two kind of rival book editors who fall in love. Shocking. But with all of Emily Henry's stories, first of all, she writes beautiful dialogue. Like you will just be like, "Oh, this is just a fun romance," and then you're like, "Why am I crying?" And I really think she kind of, she gets compared to Nora Ephron a lot, but she does. She has that spark, that like when Harry met Sally kind of something about her writing where you are just having a good time and it's fun and frothy and not too serious, but you're also like left with this emotional feeling. And
Mm,
there's always something else in her stories. Like this one, like it's a love story. It's kind of like, oh, we go to this small town, we fall in love. But also there's one of the characters is getting over the loss of a parent. And there's always this the romance that I really love is not just like, ooh, now it's spicy
Mm-hmm.
times. It's although there. I
Yeah.
always say I used to always be like, I'm a librarian, not your preacher. You can't get mad at me. Um,
That's my
but
job.
yes, you're a job. But there's always this emotional component to it as well. So Book Lovers by Emily Henry. Actually, anything that Emily Henry writes, I love
Yeah,
all of it.
I've actually read one of hers. Anna
I'm very
Jane
proud of
convinced me
you.
to read People We Meet on Vacation
Hmm.
because we were on vacation
Yeah.
last year, and I was like, well, okay, this is a good vacation read, and I enjoyed it. So this
See?
is as we're breaking down stigmas and shame here. Guys can enjoy these books too. They're not just for
Yeah.
women
And I'm
because
very
we
proud of
like
you.
love too.
Yeah.
Thank you, thank you.
I'm very proud of
And if
you.
this one's about books, then I'll definitely check it out.
Yeah. And then, I think what I've really grown to love about romance is, and it's, kind of maybe, I don't know, it's one of those things that people talk about all the time on the internet. People don't really know what it means, but it really is like celebrating the female gaze. It is the world from women's perspective. It's celebrating women's joy and fulfillment and happiness, and women not being maybe victimized or the side characters, or
Mm-hmm.
it's fun, and she's falling in love with this healthy, fun relationship. And guys could learn something in more than one way. So
Mm.
there you go,
Mm-hmm.
fellas. take,
All right, yeah.
take,
So
take
another
that.
reason to check these out. Yeah.
So,
Hey,
okay.
I mean, you can go and listen to our Song of Songs
Yeah.
episode where we talk about some of these same themes. That's another. That's a book in the Bible with
Yeah.
a female character with agency.
Yeah.
Doesn't fit some of the expectations. So there you go. All right, you
Okay.
said you had a couple more
Yeah. So
quick
in
romance
the same
recommendations.
genre, so Part of Your World by Abby Jimenez. Great. It kind of flips the Hallmark trope, um, but makes it again this deeper. She's a big city doctor. He's a small town B&B owner. The whole
Mm-hmm.
Hallmark thing, which I don't even like Hallmark movies. Apparently, I like, but but again, there's this. She's not running from her successful career. She's running from a very toxic uh, relationship she has with her parents, and not letting her be the kind of doctor she wants to be. And she's in an emotionally abusive relationship. And it talks
Mm.
getting out of that. And it talks a lot about emotional abuse and how people discredit that because it's not physical. And there's some really like important emotional work being done underneath the, oh, we're falling in love. Oh, he has a baby goat that wears pajamas. Like these are like they hook you with these things, and then there's like this emotional wallop. So
Mm.
Part of Your World by Abby Jimenez, I loved. Who also Abby Jimenez was on the Food Network. She won like Cake Wars or something, and I just don't think it's
Mm.
fair that people are good at that many things. So and
Stay
then
in your lane.
yeah, okay, and then the last one that I actually just recently finished, and this is I don't know if I would even. It is a romance. I don't know if I would put it in the category because it's just more kind of cozy fiction to me, but it's called The Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches by Sangu Mandana. And if you loved The House in the Cerulean Sea or
Mm-hmm.
any of you will like this book. It is about a society of witches, and one of the witches is brought into the situation with this kind of found family of people who have taken it upon themselves to raise three little girl witches. But in the setup for this book, witches are supposed to live separately because if witches live with each other, there's too much power, too much attention, too much danger.
Mm.
So all of the witches are isolated and don't have family, don't have
Okay.
these relationships. And so it's like, oh, what if we could have a family and be witches and be have this relationship too. So I really like it's very magical, it's very sweet. I think that people would like that too.
All right. So a little bit of romance and a little bit
Mm-hmm.
more.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, I'm gonna change tacks a little bit, and as you mentioned, it's something that maybe you're embarrassed about. I struggle in a similar way, talking about comic books, or sometimes we'll call them graphic novels to make them sound fancier. And There's a distinction that I won't get into right now, but these are just comic books. We already mentioned the X-Men, and I've been an X-Men fan for 3/4 of my life now. 92 was actually a pretty big year for the X-Men when I turned 10. But in recent years in the comics, X-Men had kind of gotten a little bit stale. They kept repeating the same sorts of stories over and over. And so about 3 years ago, they had this big change in the status quo where all the mutants went and established their own nation on this island that itself is actually alive and is kind of a mutant called Krakoa. And so now mutants are all citizens of this nation. And one of the other things that they've been able to do by combining certain powers is they can bring themselves back to life whenever they die, which is kind of lampshading something that happens all the time in comic books, right? Comic book death is a trope where characters always come back somehow, and so they're just kind of making that explicit. Where anytime any character dies, they can just bring them back immediately with all their memories intact. And they're forming this new society, and every mutant is welcome. And so a lot of characters that traditionally have been villains are included in this new society. And so they've been doing lots of interesting storytelling over the last few years of how do you build a new society from the ground up. And a book that started this year is called Immortal X-Men, written by Kieran Gillen. And this is a book that follows kind of the ruling body of this new nation called the Quiet Council. So it's like 12 different characters, and some of them are traditional good guys, right? Professor X is in there, and Nightcrawler, and Kitty Pryde. But then you also have Magneto, who's back and forth. But then it's had like actual straight up supervillains like Mr. Sinister, which if you haven't heard of him, I mean it's a ridiculous name, but it tracks. And so it's like mutant Game of Thrones or something, because they're all pushing against each other and they all have their own interests, and they're playing the politics and thinking about how they interact with the world to establish, their own society. And each issue, I think there's been about 8 so far. Each issue kind of comes from the viewpoint of a different member of this council. And so it's just doing some really interesting storytelling. There's one issue in particular that's more theological to track with what we're doing here. There's a character named Exodus who is just kind of one of these religious zealot types. And so there's a whole comic on his perspective and the way he understands mutants and how it fits in religion. So Immortal X-Men, and then another one that started recently is called X-Men Red. So in this comic, I won't go into all the details of it because it gets pretty nerdy, but there's this whole other group of mutants that were in this other dimension for a while, but they've brought them back, and then some of the mutants have basically terraformed Mars and claimed it. And so this other society that for like 1,000 years has been at war is now suddenly in this new place and is trying to figure out how to live in peace. And so it's kind of having this really interesting discussion of what does that look like for a society that's formed by war and violence. What does it do when there's no more fight? Storm is a major character in that book, and reading this has reaffirmed my view that whenever they do make an X-Men movie again, no one can play Storm other than Beyonce, because that is the energy that Storm has. And so if you read X-Men Red, you will see what I'm talking about. So those are both. There's been a lot of series in the new X-Men line, but those are my favorites this year. So that's Immortal X-Men by Kieran Gillen and X-Men Red, which is written by Al Ewing. All right, so what's your next pick, Dara?
Okay. So this one is a little bit more in the fantasy, kind of magical realism. Except it includes dragons. Do we call dragons magical realism? I don't know. So it's
It
called.
depends on how their powers or things are
They were
described.
grown in the lab. Yeah. So this is called When Women Were Dragons by Kelly Barnhill. And I actually, anything that Kelly Barnhill writes is a green light for me. Kelly Barnhill is actually a children's author. She writes more almost middle grade fiction. She won the Newbery Award or one of my favorite books of all time, which is The Girl Who Drank the Moon, which is exquisite, which also has a dragon in it. But this is her first adult fiction novel. And it's a weird little book. Like, I think that this is probably a divisive book. I think some people will read it and not like it at all. I loved it, and it came at a really good time for me. And it basically is like it kind of there is an event, and there's some similarities between lessons in chemistry. It's really like kind of in a fictional kind of 50s, 60s world.
Mm.
There is, and kind of playing on some of the like women's movement tropes where
Mm-hmm.
instead of like everyone being like, I'm going to go to work and get a job, there is a mass dragoning. And all of the
Mm.
women are pissed off and they're not going to take it anymore. And they turn into dragons and fly away. And so, like,
Man.
there's a spiritual component for you. They're the dragon
Yeah.
raptor. But they're so all of a
Dragon
sudden, all
Rapture.
these people are left behind. Like, where did the women go? Where did the moms go? Where did the grandmothers go? And
Mm.
not everybody went. And some
Yeah.
people started to go, but made themselves stay and regret that they didn't go. Or, there's all these like, and then there's resentment from the kids that were left behind because their moms were like, I can't take it anymore. Goodbye. I'm a dragon. So
Mm.
there is all these really there's just and then there's all these pamphlets that are made about recognize the signs if your wife is becoming a dragon and how to keep your daughter from becoming a dragon and a lot of like but it just is talking a lot about women's anger and women's rage and the ways that you keep that bottled inside until it literally explodes into like tooth and claw scales
Mm.
taking to the air with fire. And I did want to read, I have a quote from this one because this book came at a really important time for me. So it was, and
Mm-hmm.
that may have
A
been,
dragony time.
yes, a dragony time. Books are so subjective. Like you can read something at one
Mm-hmm.
point in your life and it not connect to you at all. And a different day, you're like, this is the best thing I've ever read. So that's why I never judge people's book taste because it's completely subjective.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but anyways, the quote from When Women Were Dragons was that I really loved. It said, anger is a funny thing, and it does funny things to us if we keep it inside. I encourage you to consider a question. Who benefits, my dear, when you force yourself to not feel angry? And so,
Mm.
yeah, who benefits when you force yourself to not feel angry is something that I
Yeah.
have asked myself a lot. Lo, these many years.
Yeah, right. Like that's the appeal of fantasy is it's
Hmm.
taking something right that sounds ridiculous almost, right? People
Yeah,
turning into dragons, but like I mean it's obviously not too subtle what that's getting at,
right.
but by putting it in this different, scenario, it allows you to think about real world kind of stuff. I mean, that's going back to what I was talking about with the X-Men. I mean, that's why they're so loved is this is a group that represents oppressed minorities.
Hmm.
And that's I'm probably going to do a whole episode about this next year at some point of yeah, what does it mean when an oppressed minority decides we're going to go do our own thing? We don't need you to accept us anymore because
Hmm.
maybe that's never going to happen. And so yeah, that's why those comics and a lot in this new series have been so interesting. Is it's thinking about some of those issues of this subgroup and how they exist on their own and
Hmm.
form something new when they yeah in a similar way just we're not going to put up with this anymore. So that kind of leads into my other non-comic book pick, which is called This Here Flesh by Cole Arthur Riley. Like I said, my two favorite books came from authors I found on Instagram. So Cole Riley is the creator of the Black Liturgies Instagram. Also, definitely recommend following her there. Not daily, but most days we'll put out some sort of prayer and spiritual practice from her perspective as a black woman. And obviously, I am a straight white man, and so I feel it's important, even though sometimes it does feel like work, to read things from other perspectives. But this one really didn't feel like work. Like it's some of the most poetic prose that I've read, and I just love the experience of reading this book. And you know, uh, so picking up on what I was just talking about, it's centered around this question of what does it mean to bring our experiences in this body, physical, emotional, spiritual, into our understanding of God and our understanding of ourselves. And obviously,
Mm-hmm.
she's doing that from a black woman's perspective. And this is important for me as a white guy because I don't have to think about that most of the time, right? This has
Mm-hmm.
been so much of the conversation in recent years that my perspective tends to just get taken as normal, and everyone else is expected to fit into that. And so she's in this book dismantling the ways that we colonize the image of God in others, is the way she puts it. Because she points out that our understanding of God is always going to be contextual, right? It's going to be coming from where we are, but you can't make that singular, as if like my perspective is the only way to understand. My context is the only true one, and so we're going to colonize that understanding and import that on others, right? That's what tends to happen by theologians who look like me. And right, that makes it sound like it's attacking people, but it's really her sharing her story. So if you just look at like the table of contents, the chapters are things like dignity and wonder, going back to the say yes earlier, the body, fear, lament, right? So looking at these virtues or these things that we struggle with as part of life, and how that is informed by her story. So she talks a lot about her grandma. She talks about family trauma, which sometimes she names, sometimes she just hints at. But it is ultimately a celebration of the body, of the self, of who we are actually made to be. And so I want to read a little bit here where she is. This is from the chapter talking about the body. So she says, "For me, the story of God becoming body is only matched by God's submission to the body of a woman. That the creator of the cosmos would choose to rely on an embodied creation. To be grown, fed, delivered, God put faith in a body, in Mary's muscles and hormones, bowels and breasts. And when Christ's body is broken and blood shed, we should hold in mystery that first a woman's body was broken, her blood shed, in order to deliver the hope of the world into the world." Pretty good message for the first Sunday of Advent there.
Yeah.
So, right, bringing her body in and thinking about the female experience as part of spirituality, in contrast to the message that often is picked up in the church, especially the white evangelical church that we were both raised in. This is a quote that I think I shared as soon as I read it because it was just so challenging, but so well said. It says, "I think whiteness knows that the more detached I am from my body, the easier that body will be to colonize and use toward whiteness' own end. It desires that my mind be fixed firmly on an immaterial realm, that I become numb to any present and material injustices. It's this belief system that indoctrinates us to sneer at social justice but bow to evangelism. After all, evangelism has the ability to exercise the same muscles as colonization, telling someone what to think and be. It can be a form of ownership in the name of heaven." So, evangelism is colonization. So she's not pulling any punches. Like I said, it's not just this whole here's why everyone is terrible. It is a celebration of life and acknowledging that it has to be all of it. It has to be lament, and it has to be acknowledging that rage that, like you were talking about, makes you want to turn into a dragon sometimes, or me to go to comic books to want to Hulk out. Right? It's bringing all of that in, but to acknowledge that to lament what is wrong is to acknowledge that there is a deeper belief in a world that is good. And it's only by naming what is not good right here, right now, that we can make this world good here and now. So
Mm-hmm.
that would probably be my favorite book this year. That is This Here Flesh by Cole Arthur Riley.
I need to get that because I followed her for a long time on Instagram and I love her writing and it's so impactful. And I think that Instagram poets or Instagram writers, they get this bad rap. Well, for
Mm-hmm.
people who are trying to kind of gatekeep the publishing industry or
Mm-hmm.
be snobby about poetry or and but they because it's so immediate, it can really kind of speak to what everybody's feeling on that day. And you don't get that with a book that you have to wait a really long time for, you know? And there's
Hmm.
something to be said for kind of experiencing that grief or that anger or the disbelief as it's happening with somebody who can put it into words better than you can, where you're just like, I don't like it. I don't like how this feels. Um, that another one of my favorite books that I read is an Instagram poet. She used the derogatory term, Kate Bear, who is on
Hmm.
Instagram, and her book is called And Yet. She has three books of poetry, and I just love her. It's Bear, Baer, and she takes she does a lot of just what it's like to be a wife and a mom and a woman in these times. And she's a white woman, so her experiences are, different. And I think it's always important when you're talking about feminist stuff to remember that white feminism is has its own blind spots, and you need to be really thinking about other people's experiences. Um, but she'll take her hate mail or her hate DMs and she turns them into poems. Like she'll do like blackout poetry where she takes people saying like you're fat, you're ugly, men don't like you. I bet your husband is embarrassed about you, all these
Mm.
things. And she blacks out the words and makes poems out of them. And so
Nice.
it's really powerful. And I love that she keeps, I don't know, she just kind of just turns that feedback on its head, the trolls on its head, and makes something beautiful, like making art. It kind of reminds me about how people used to say about Rachel Held Evans that she would turn her hate mail into origami. Like she
Mm.
would print out really mean tweets about herself, and she would make them into origami and like hang them around her desk. And I just like turning something horrible and ugly into something beautiful. I think is really cool. So that's also a recommendation that I would throw out there.
Yeah, I mean that's what we're after here is people that can reflect on the world, whether that's nonfiction and coming at it from a theological standpoint, or it's fantasy or romance. That they're acknowledging everything that goes into being human, but finding the beauty in that, and not pulling any punches about how difficult it can be at times. But it gives us something to hope for, and that sense of wonder. I think that in everything that I loved this year, just reflecting on just the ones I've mentioned, that's such a big part of it is where do we find wonder. So now I wanted to transition and think just what were some of the things that maybe you reread this year or older books that you picked up that you've been meaning to get to that aren't as new. Do you have any maybe comfort things you went back to or other things that you when you came back to it you had a different perspective?
I actually have spent a huge part of my year with this, so I'm glad that you asked. So I have converted your wife to the Sarah J. Massiverse, where
Mm.
I'm not saying it's the best. I'm saying I love it.
Hmm.
And for me, it is kind of comic book where you're just like you've got this huge cast of characters and they're doing all
Hmm.
these fun things, and it's the relationships and the crossovers and the anyways. So I love that, and so that kind of gave me the biggest book hangover because I was like more, more, more. My little like you kind of start looking for that serotonin hit of a really good series and you just kind of can't latch on.
Mm.
So I started reading, I think the oldest book is like, I don't know, it came out like 20 years ago, probably. I started reading Cassandra Clare's Shadowhunters series. And this is where
Okay.
I'm going to make the pitch to all the theology bros out there in podcast land. Because, okay, this is a YA series and it is strongly in the YA, especially the first series. So, what she does is there are multiple series within this larger um, universe and they all build on each other. But they are set in different times. And so you kind of have to go back. There's several reading guides that you can look at that will tell you the order to read them in. So I think I'm on the 12th one that I've read this year. So there's a lot of books to catch up on. And so
Okay.
it's been fun. Here's why I think that Bible theology nerds would like these books.
Okay.
So they're literally about demon hunting angels. So
Mm-hmm.
you have Nephilim. You
Mm-hmm.
have everything is about there is this mandate from the angel, and the first angel who turns this race of shadow hunters into to give them powers of the angel. And so they'll say different angels' names when they get their swords out, and they have seraph blades, so it's all very angel adjacent.
Mm-hmm.
And then they have, but even to the extent where they have these fighting partner bonds that are called parabatai bonds, and they're based on the bond that David and Jonathan had. And so Jonathan Shadowhunter was the first Shadowhunter, and he makes this thing. So there's all of these connections to biblical and biblical allusions. There's all these
Michael.
yeah, there's all these allusions to biblical stories, but there's also a lot of cool just other mythology, and she's really into literature. So there's all these quotes from literature. And here's what I'm going to say. Here's my caveat. The most popular, like it starts out with the Mortal Instruments series, which is my least
Mm-hmm.
favorite.
Okay.
So like the Mortal Instruments series, I'm like, this is okay. It's very teen. But then it does this
It gets
thing.
better.
Well, and it sounds crazy to be like, no, you have to read these three books and then get to this series and then get to this series. But they all grow off of each other. It's like it's like what if a bunch of Hebrew majors wrote a YA series? What if a bunch of dorky teens? So Mortal
Uh,
Instruments is meh. Infernal Devices is amazing. Dark Artifices is amazing. And then now I'm about to start the Last Hours series. So they're fun. They are nerdy, enjoyable, fun. The movie adaptation was horrible, and the TV adaptation was pretty bad too, and failed miserably. So it kind of, I think that kind of the author, because of that, kind of doubled down on writing the books. And so the books have gotten better as they go on. And so now she's like kind of, they're much more adult now, not in like adult, but like more just, yeah, they're more mature and layered and really interesting with like the ethical things that they're talking about. There's a lot of there's a lot of questions about like these Nephilim who think they're better than all the downworlders, and and there are a lot of good parallels for the world that we live in with religious intolerance, and so it's really interesting. Her the last book, which I don't know if this is the last book ever, but everybody is acting because it comes out I think in the new year. So I've been trying to get caught up so that I can be
Part of the
in the
conversation.
zeitgeist. I
Uh-huh.
want to be part of the conversation. But
The
yeah, I
pressure, I
thought,
know.
yeah. And I mean, this is just as a personal aside. Harry Potter was, I loved Harry Potter so much. It was so much like a part of my personality and my bookish life. And I mean, J.K. Rowling has really hurt so many people, and I don't understand why she keeps doing it. And so it kind of has made that series not as fun and enjoyable for me
Mm.
anymore. So this has kind of been like a fun look back at some of the like getting to be engrossed in a world with a bunch of different characters and a new magic system and all that
Mm-hmm.
kind of stuff. So it's been kind of nice to get back into something like that and have fun with it, but not feel like guilty about supporting somebody who's hurting people.
Yeah.
So, anyways, I've just really liked it.
Okay.
Let's. I just want to learn more about Parabatai and Jonathan and David and.
So again, my rereads, just looking at some of my favorites this year. Again, kind of in two very different categories. There's a lot of comic books that I went back to. I've already talked about some of this on the podcast. I read through a whole bunch of Thor comics before the new movie came out. So the writer Jason Aaron did a whole run, and he's the one who introduced the Jane Foster as Thor. And so that was, I remember reading that when it came out and loving it. And so it was really nice to go back through it all at once, and it was great. There's a comic series called Saga by Brian K. Vaughan and Fiona Staples. That when it was coming out was always like at the top of the best comics of the year. It's kind of a Romeo and Juliet in a very simplistic way because there's these two warring planets and soldiers from both sides get together and have a baby. And so it sounds like a really simplistic setup, but it's very adult, and I mean that in every sense. There is, all sorts of content warnings on it, but it's really thinking about like how do you actually have a family on the run, and when all these different sorts of forces are working against you, and touches on some very difficult issues of sexuality and gender and these sorts of ideas, but it's also a world where there's magic and space travel. So anyway, Saga, they did like 60 issues, and then they took a break for like 2 years, maybe 3 years, and it finally we came back this year. So I wanted to reread the first half of it, which the end of it definitely emotionally destroyed me again, and I'm still kind of mad at the author for a choice that was made. And there's been like 6 issues since it came back, and I enjoyed it. I'm still kind of waiting for it to really pick back up. And again, because of some of the choices that were made at the end of the first half, I still have not fully gotten over it. So I'm still a little mad at you, Brian K. Vaughan, but Saga continues to be great. So if you haven't read that, you can go and read the first half of that. I definitely enjoyed doing that this year.
That's a very popular choice at the public library. People love Saga
Okay,
in
yeah.
the old graphic novel section.
I also reread a short series on Hawkeye that the Disney Plus series was based on. So it was written by Matt Fraction with art by David Aha. And it's very much like Hawkeye is a street level guy. I know Hawkeye gets a lot of hate for being like the lamest Avenger. And this isn't arguing that he's like the coolest Avenger. It's just like, yeah, he is kind of a street level guy, and it's him dealing with, just some local thugs, this gang, the tracksuit mafia, but just really gorgeous art, and yeah, the relationships that are formed in that comic are really great. So some non-comic book picks. Probably my favorite thing that I reread this year was Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck. So I turned 40 this year, and part of that, I wanted to go back to some of my favorite things that I had read and see how they held up, because Grapes of Wrath was probably my favorite book that was assigned reading in high school, and I actually appreciated it even more reading it now, as an adult, right? So I assume people have heard of Grapes of Wrath, but as someone who grew up in Oklahoma, this is kind of a story that's talking about that, people from Oklahoma moving out because of the pressures of, at the time it was the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression, but it really seems to resonate more in this time, right? There are cops that seem to just be out to protect the interest of the wealthy elites, and people are struggling to survive, and you're seeing the cost of capitalism, which I know at the time when Steinbeck wrote it, he kind of got in some trouble. And, when I was in high school, I didn't really know anything about any of this stuff, but it still like spoke to me then. But to see how it speaks to, I think, this present moment and some of these same struggles that we're facing, just the ways that capitalism can harm people. A lot of things haven't really changed in almost 100 years. And so I appreciated reading that. I actually finished it as we took a road trip out to California. So I got to finish this book about Oklahomans going to California while I was going to California. So it was fun.
You were an Okie.
Yeah, I am an Okie, even though I moved to Kansas because I was ready to be out of Oklahoma. All right, so those were our recommendations of things that were new this year, as well as some of the things that we went back to this year. Like we said, we're not here to guilt trip or gatekeep and say you have to read this. But we do encourage you to check out some of the things we mentioned. Check out things that are outside your comfort zone sometimes, but also find things that give you comfort. Whatever is going to give you a sense of wonder and appreciate life. Whether that's learning about how difficult life is for people with different experiences, or it's escaping to a fantasy world. All right, well, Dara, normally at this point we would do our pop culture consolations and desolations, but for our end of the year coverage, we're actually going to have a special episode devoted just to that. So our listeners will get to hear some of your consolations for 2022 in a few weeks. But I want to thank you for coming on the show. And as we're closing, we've talked a lot about Instagram people. So if you want to tell people where they can find you on Instagram for more book recommendations.
Yeah, so my Instagram is Dara Reads Okay. It's all one word. Dara, Dara, Reads Okay. It's for Dara Reads Okay or Dara
Yep,
Reads Oklahoma,
I
however you
get it.
want to read that.
Mm-hmm.
It's funny because I explained
That's how
it.
jokes work.
But yeah, I just post books that I like on there. I don't do usually negative reviews. I'll just
Mm-hmm.
put them in my stories because I don't want to hurt authors' feelings. So yeah, if you want to if it's on my feed, it's a book I liked. I am never going to make a reel or anything like
Mm.
that. So I
We're
will
we're
never
too old
be,
for that. People have
yeah,
talked to me about you could do a TikTok. No,
no.
no.
I watch TikToks 2 weeks after they happen like an adult.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I'm never going to be a 20,000 person book Instagram. But if you want books that I actually really like and enjoyed, even if maybe they aren't going to win any awards, then come follow me. And sometimes they accidentally win awards,
Yeah, you never know.
and you never know.
That's okay. It's not about how big your platform is. It's are you enjoying things and helping other people
Yeah,
find things they might enjoy. As a pop
yeah,
culture pastor, that's the evangelism that I try and do. Not trying to colonize your book list, but hey, we love this, so you might too. All right, well, thanks
yeah.
for being on the show, Dara. We will hear from
Thank
you in a few
you.
weeks. Well, as we close the show, I want to get real with you for just a minute. We talked a lot about books that inspire wonder. They give us a sense of awe for the world that we live in, the lives that we lead. And like we said, we hope you find things that will inspire wonder. And most of all, we hope that this podcast is one of them. If you have been impacted, if this podcast has given you a greater sense of beauty that exists in this universe, then why not give that opportunity to someone else? So share this podcast on social media, subscribe, tell your friends about it. They might find some new books that they like, but most importantly, they'll witness the beauty of Pop Culture Pastor. This podcast is produced by me. Thanks again to Dara Tinius for coming on the show. As she said, you can find her on Instagram at Dara Reads OK. Follow me on Instagram or Facebook at Pop Culture Pastor. You'll find a list of all my favorite books of this year ranked. So check that out, or you can check the show notes to see the ones that we mentioned today. Our theme song is Be Thou My Vision from the 8-Bit Hymnal by Mr. Tyler Larson. Join us next week, that's right, not in 2 weeks, 1 week from today, for our coverage of the best music of 2022. You are now dismissed. Go in peace.